old banjo tune going up Cripple Creek.
This is Kentucky Afield Radio. We sound a little different today. We're listening to a style of music likely best described as homespun. And it's not just the tunes we're listening to, but the style of how it's presented. It's complete with hum, hiss, pause button clicks. Anyone can see the difference between a home movie and Hollywood. But generations-old personal audio like this aren't really considered scratchy home recordings. Instead, it's pure gold. I'm Charlie Baglin, and we go inside outdoors all the way back to 1976 with the homegrown talents of Fiddlin Edgar Smyth. In the hollers of Lee County, Kentucky, Edgar never made a real album. He made real friends, and one of them was a little grade school kid to whom he taught the basics of outdoor life, as only an old-timer could. Lessons learned, a companionship lost, until a little white cassette tape surfaced. And what was on that old tape that Edgar had recorded? Is it really all that different from what's on old tapes we find ourselves in the backs of drawers, in old boxes in the basement? They are parts of our past, just like aging diaries and family photographs, but with a voice. Two voices that share a passion for the subject are on the program. They are from the Kentucky Historical Society's Oral History Commission. But in the first half hour, we reminisce with Hank Patton, who was that little boy. And while Mr. Patton is a grown man now, as he sits with me in the studio, he is still very much 10. We will be back in a moment. This is Kentucky Afield Radio.
You know our patch, but there are some things about the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife you may have never dreamed. For a young mind, every day is an adventure. In schools and in summer camps, we reach 70,000 kids every year, keeping the world a hands-on, minds-on, feet-wet place where nature and knowledge can take root. Kentucky Fish and Wildlife, your partner in the great outdoors. And you thought we were just fishing and hunting? Hunt more at fw.ky.gov.
If life were a movie, it would have its own soundtrack. My name is Charlie Baglin, and thanks for joining us on a special episode of Kentucky Afield Radio. Hank, we are listening to the music of Fiddlin Edgar Smyth. Who is Edgar Smyth?
Edgar Smyth was one of those people that was probably a hero in my life that I attribute a lot of the reason, the passion I have for fish and wildlife. Edgar when I met him, was about a 75-year-old, 5'5", skinny as a rail, eastern Kentucky mountain guy from Lee County, Kentucky. He was a retired Army veteran. He had lost 3 fingers on his right hand in World War II. He had thrown a hand grenade to save his squad, was in Saipan, was in all of the South Pacific as an infantryman. My dad had met this gentleman trying to buy a piece of property. My dad had gone down to that area of the Leco area trying to find a farm to buy. And Edgar had a piece of property he thought he might want to sell. And when we drove up to his house the first time we met him, he was skinning a rabbit that he'd shot out of his garden, and he had blood over both hands and a shotgun over his shoulder. And I kind of laughed, and, it makes a great impression on a 7-year-old young man like me at the time. And every third word out of Edgar's mouth was an explicative, being an old Army veteran, and we got to just visit him with him and became very close friends, and he became quite a friend of my dad's. At the time we lived in eastern Kentucky, but we came over to Lee County to visit with him and found out that Edgar picked the banjo and played the mandolin, and after he was wounded in World War II, his actual job was going to pick with Chet Atkins as part of the USO tour that they did all the troops. Well, my dad found out about that. He said, well, you need to make us a tape. He said, well, I don't do that much except in the winter. And Edgar was real bad. He had been afflicted by malaria pretty bad. And in the winter, he'd go in his house, and it was a typical hoarder's home, had everything in the world he ever owned was right around him, he and his wife. And Edgar sat down with an old cassette player, the old rectangular cassette player, and he decided he was going to pick out a tune for my dad and make that tape he'd always talked about.
I'm going to try to make that tape now. I want to make it for all of you fellers. For Hank and Roxine and Hanky and Barky and Rowena and her boyfriend and so forth. That okay? Okay. Smith, how was she found? Shot through the heart, lying cold on the ground. Blood it was scattered and poured on the ground, and blood marked the spot where poor Ellen was found. Warden just told me that soon I'd be free to go to her grave beneath that old willow tree. But I'll never be free from the sins of my past. Poor Ellen Smith, how was she found? She shot through the heart, lying cold on the ground.
This isn't music you are going to download from iTunes on a daily basis. It is not featured on American Idol. It was never intended to have a world audience. You were that audience.
And oh, by the way, remember, he lost 3 fingers on his right hand. He did the old claw-style banjo. He couldn't play the mandolin exactly the way he wanted to because he didn't have his last 3 fingers on his right hand. And to listen to this tape and to listen to the way he played that music was unbelievable that he could still do that. But his passion was playing that music.
I remember walking up to you one day a month or 2 or so ago, and you said, "By the way, Charlie, I have this old cassette. I don't know what's on it, but I'm scared to play it because I'm scared it will break, and I have no means to play it, and I can't put it on a CD. Can you help me?"
I did know what it was. I had heard that tape when I was probably 10 or 11 years old. And my mother recently passed, and we were going through some of her things, and I found that cassette tape. And I played it one time in my vehicle radio, and I'm like, oh, my goodness, I'm going to destroy this. I can't let this. I've got to get it some way digitally put on something so I can use it. And that's when I brought it to you, because I was so afraid to tear it up and lose it.
He introduces the tape by saying, "A hello to Hank, Roxine."
That was my mother. Her name was Rostine, but he always called her Roxine.
He mentions Hanky.
That's what my mom called me when I was a kid.
You are Hanky.
Yep. And Rowena was my sister.
And her boyfriend.
That's it, and I don't know who that was at the time.
This was recorded in 1976, and you said he was 75 or so.
Probably, yes.
At the time. People say the Bible was not written for people in biblical times. It was written for people today. I wonder if that cassette tape that turned into a CD is more appreciated today than it was all those years ago.
Absolutely no question. When I heard it as a child, the song that I always remembered was Purple Robe. Edgar would never strike you as a religious man. Trust me, again, every third word was an explicative of some sort with lots of color. But to hear him on this tape was almost a testament to the other side of him that you didn't know. And I, at 10, 11 years old, I wasn't capable of understanding that. To hear the tape after not seeing it for 30 years or 40 showed me a whole other side of this man that I held as a hero in my life. And you're right, it means more to me now today than it ever did.
It's a story so unkind in the holy book we find. It tells how Jesus stood alone one day, false accused and condemned, yet they found no fault in him. That man who wore the scarlet purple robe, my Savior wore. Oh, what shame for me he bore, as he stood alone forsaken on that day. And they placed upon his head piercing thorn of blood-stained red. His raiment was a scarlet purple robe.
This may be the first and only time you will ever hear the music of Fiddlin' Edgar Smyth on the radio. But there are old songs, happy birthday renditions, piano recitals, that could be as close as some dusty old box somewhere on a shelf in your home. And hearing this program may encourage you to take a look and take a listen, see what's hidden in there. The farther we go back in time, many will agree that the closer we are to a simpler life. In the case of our guest this half hour, we uncover the early recollections of how a young whippersnapper, little boy, from Owsley County, received his introduction to the outdoors, learning to squirrel hunt, fish, a path that eventually became the road to the directorship of the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Division of Law Enforcement, authorities we also call game wardens, but more properly, conservation officers. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin, and we will continue our conversation with Hank Patton after the break. This is Kentucky Afield Radio, and my name is Charlie Baglin. Hank Patton is my guest in this first half hour, and we are talking about gold mining, in a sense. The gold that is there to be mined from the old tapes and old reels that we find under our beds, in the backs of drawers, on shelves in the basement. And we're talking about an old tape that came back into Hank's life, recorded by an individual from Lee County, Kentucky, Fiddlin Edgar Smyth. Can you see him playing that banjo now?
Yes, sir. As clearly today as the day I first saw him.
Where do you see him playing into this little microphone for the cassette deck?
When you walked into his home, basically it was an eastern Kentucky home. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was home. But the thing that always intrigued me was, A, it was always so hot in that house during the winter because he had the malaria, and it was usually over 100 degrees. Everything they owned, there were pathways through the floor and stuff, newspapers, magazines, boxes, trinkets, odds and ends were stacked to the ceiling. And he had an easy chair with a lamp beside of it, and I can see that table and that cassette recorder sitting on that lamp stand, and him sitting there and plucking out a tune or two.
Lump it like it, that's it. I guess most people would lump it. Well, I think that's just about all on tape or room I have on this side of the tape, so I'll just turn it over and finish up on the other side, okay? Okie doke. If it suits you, it does me.
The fact that if there's room enough on this side of the tape, that talks about how technology has changed. Recording media have changed. People today they don't have cassette decks. They don't walk around with reel-to-reel recorders. In their pocket, they have a phone that will record birthday parties. And would you agree that there is an absolute treasure trove in all of these recordings? Maybe not today, but in 20, 30, 40 years down the pike?
Absolutely. I mean, look at what, we've got more technology in our pocket now than was even available then. And you see these folks who are out videoing their hunts, or they're recording a fishing trip or something they're doing with their kids or with their family. And, those things don't mean much at that time. But 30 years from now, what's it going to mean to you? Where does that take you back to then? And that's exactly what this tape did.
I think Edgar probably didn't imagine in 1976 that we'd be talking about this today.
Probably wouldn't have wanted us to.
Now, that's it, I say. If you don't care what you say, it might be. My dogs are barking in there, and me is screwing the song up, and I don't know. Well, life goes on just the same, though. Here we go on another one. Oh, beautiful star of Bethlehem, shining so far through shadow dim, light to light the way they've gone, hiding in trouble far into the place where Jesus lay. Beautiful star of Bethlehem, shine on. Beautiful star of Bethlehem, shining divine with glory come. Beautiful star of Bethlehem, shine on. It's the light that lights the way into the land of perfect day. Beautiful star of Bethlehem, shine on.
This is homespun music. This is Americana. This is Appalachia. This is Kentucky, long ago. Poor Ellen Smith, Black Mountain Rag, Beautiful Star of Bethlehem. We still hear some at Christmas. Old Cross Roads, not Crossroads, but Cross Roads, as in the crucifix. Little Maggie, Purple Robe you mentioned. These obviously were his favorite songs.
They were. Absolutely by memory. If I remember watching him cut one of those songs, he had no music, just whatever came to him when it came to his mind.
Memories are what they are. Some of them, they're very happy. Sometimes they bring back sad memories, sibling rivalries. You never know what memories are going to surface in these, but you seem to welcome every one of them.
It was amazing the things that I remembered, and the nuances about Edgar. Edgar didn't have any running water, and every day he packed it to a spring, and it brought up the memories of me going up to that spring as a child and drinking out of a gourd dipper out of the spring. We didn't worry about being sick or something happening, who knows. But we got right down in the spring, and my first squirrel was killed with Edgar, with a 12-gauge shotgun, and I shot the gun, and I was so afraid that he'd be mad at me if I acted like it hurt. But I was 6 years old shooting a 12-gauge, and I remember walking around going, I can't even cry. He may make fun of me. I may let him down.
This is something I've started to do, and nobody in my family knows that I'm doing it, so I'm sort of being covert about it. As I record our big meals, just like the tapes that I found of my personal history from back in the early 60s. It would be of Christmas morning opening gifts, Thanksgiving dinners, and the big occasions. And I started to record those, not because I want to listen to them today, but maybe people down the road 20 or 30 years may get a charge out of hearing what was going on. And you sort of get a feel of that from listening to Edgar. You said he was quite the sportsman out of necessity.
Absolutely.
You have become quite the sportsman yourself.
Out of passion.
We have not talked about your career at all, but I think that it's interesting how something that happens when you're 7, 8, 9 years old can influence you in your career today.
You know, we talk about imprinting in the wildlife side of this business, but, you know, we're doing it to people, too. I mean, we're making a difference.
He got you started, but you had to follow the road yourself.
I always make the joke that when I was an 18-year-old, one of my closest friends was Teddy Paul Markham, was a game warden with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he'd take me out and let me ride and patrol with him. That was back in the old days when they gave him a radio, a gun, and they drove their own personal vehicle. And we'd go check trout stockings in Buffalo Creek, and we do those things, and that was the passion that I wanted to do that so bad. It shaped my life. I always tell a story. It took 26 years to get back to Fish and Wildlife, but I made it. So
there are some copies of this now on CD.
That's correct.
You've given this now, I trust, to several people?
I've given it to my brother and my 2 sisters. I've got those copies, and I even gave one to one of my best friends who didn't know the guy, but he just heard it and wanted to hear it, wanted a copy of it. So
it's absolutely classic. That is true Kentucky. That's true history of Hank Patton.
It is.
What kind of reaction have they had?
About the same one that I had, Charlie. A tear down their cheek.
Well, Hank, I appreciate you coming out. I'm glad I got to hear it.
Well, I appreciate you doing it for me.
We will have some more on protecting some of these old audio archives of our life when our program continues. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglan. The theme of the show this week is the audio side of memorabilia. Not just the photos and hand-me-downs, but the sound of a voice, a car engine, ball on a bat, the cocking of a double-barrel shotgun. They bring back memories in a heartbeat. We talk to specialists on the subject from the Kentucky Historical Society after our fishing report.
This is Jeff Crosby with the Central District Fishing Report. District lake temperatures are running in the mid to upper 70s. Black bass fishing across the district is very good, especially at Taylorsville, Harrington, Gifts Creek, and at several of the small state-owned lakes such as Elmer and Beaver Lakes. Currently, points seem to be the biggest magnet for bass right now, especially points that are in close proximity to creek channels. Crankbaits, spinner baits are currently productive baits, but plastic baits have been productive as well, fished around shoreline cover in 6 to 8 feet of water. Also at Taylorsville Lake, channel and blue catfish are being caught using cut shad in about 6 to 18 feet of water. Channel catfish are being caught on the flats where blue cats are more associated to the river or creek channels. So good luck, good fishing, and I hope to see you on the water.
This is Rob Rold in the Northwestern Fishery District. At Nolin Lake, anglers have been catching a lot of hand-sized bluegill by fishing the upper ends of some of the coves, especially those with gravel or sandy bottoms, and look for overhanging trees there as well as the bluegill make their beds below them. At Rough River Lake, anglers are starting to pick up some hybrid striped bass by trolling, and they're trolling the areas of the upper South Fork around Panther Creek on down to Mid-Lake. Bluegill are hot at most of our small impoundments in the district. Carpenter Lake's especially good. Mosay Lakes is doing especially well, as are most of the pits on Peabody Wildlife Management Area. And look for overhanging branches and vegetation, as those species like to build their nest in these secluded spots. That's an update from the Northwestern Fishery District. Please remember, be safe on the water and wear your life jacket.
In western Kentucky, down at Kentucky and Barkley Lakes, it's still good fishing. They're catching bass out on the ledges using crankbaits and plastic worms. Also catching some bass up shallow around woody habitat, woody structure around boat docks with spinner baits and, again, plastic worms and lizards. Bluegill fishing is really hot right now. Hopefully we'll see some willowfly hatches coming up here pretty soon. But fishing up around the shoreline and steep drop-offs where there's some rocky shoreline, always good for them bluegill.
Catfish out on the main river channel, blues are especially good going into the summer months. And then crappie. A few crappie still being caught. It's kind of slowed down, but if you fish out there on the ledges with some minnows or jigs, you ought to be able to get you back into some crappie. Well, this is Paul Reister, and I hope you find you a good day to go fishing.
Kentucky Afield Radio, painting pictures with words. After the break.
Stretch!
It's not easy reaching your arms around a giant white oak tree.
Mom, I can't reach your hand.
It's not easy finding one either. But old-growth woodlands are another example of what Kentucky Nature license plates work to protect.
Big tree.
And even though this boy's in 5th grade, he might see college before those fingertips meet. And with some of these trees, he may still need a little help from his sister.
Oh,
Kentucky Nature Plates. No wonder they say nature's finest.
This looks like your average fishing license. But look again. It's helping stock 4 million fish in public waters. On land, it manages 1 million acres of wilderness. In the classroom, it teaches kids the wonders of nature. I'm Tim Farmer with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. Hunting and fishing licenses and boater registration dollars make a difference, and you're a part of it. Get your license wherever sporting goods are sold or at fw.ky.gov.
We are back, and my name is Charlie Baglin. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. The theme of the show is sort of a blast from the past. In the first half hour, we talked about finding old recordings around our homes from when our parents were young and had these newfangled gadgets called tape recorders, and they would record everything, Christmas dinners, personal thoughts. For the rest of the show, we want to look at that from a more formal perspective. From the Kentucky Oral History Commission, part of the Kentucky Historical Society, we welcome Administrator Sarah Milligan and current Chairman Dr. Richard Taylor. What is the history of oral history? Is there a difference between an old recording of, say, the Hindenburg disaster? Is that oral history, or is it oral history something else?
Oral history is actually a defined discipline of study with set guidelines. Oral history, in order for it to be an oral history as defined by those guidelines, it has to be recorded in either audio or video. It has to be at least 2 people talking. So, for example, me sitting down with somebody else for a specific reason that we're going to have that conversation that's recorded. So it has to be about a historical topic, an event in time, a profession, an occupation, something very specific. It has to be at least 2 people. It can't just be me handing someone a tape recorder and saying, all those stories that you've told me for the last 10 years, I'd love it if you just recorded those. I'll be back in an hour. Just talk to yourself.
Why wouldn't that be considered oral history? Because I remember sitting down with my grandfather and say, tell me those stories about you walking up and down the river. And
were you there listening to him whenever you recorded it and asking him questions?
No, he was telling me the stories.
It's not that is not a history that is given orally. It's just not this discipline of oral history. Part of my job is to do outreach in the state to train people on how to do oral history interviews, and you want to get the most holistic picture of what that event or that time or that story that you're specifically sitting down with them. So it's to ask those questions of how did that feel? What did that look like? What did that smell like when you were doing that? To get the sensory, really understand what that experience was by listening to someone tell the story. Maybe they've told it throughout their entire life, but by really intensely listening to what they're saying and not saying, you can ask pointed questions to help draw out the larger picture of those events.
It seems, and Richard, I'll point this question to you. It seems that until the dawn of the printing press, oral history was basically all we had. Am I right? Word of mouth?
Right. So you're speaking about pre-literate cultures, and the history, technically, is the recorded past, and that suggests something that has, in some way or another, a degree of permanency about it. What little we know in Kentucky that comes to us, other than through the official, documented, printed record, comes through diaries, through journals, and through Shane and through Draper, who were 2 individuals who, in some ways, were the first oral historians, though they had the only means they had to record the people they spoke to was the written word, and unfortunately in some instances they doctored or altered that in some way. The problem is there are a number of questions we'd like to ask that we can't ask now.
But really, oral history, the uniqueness is that you can get a first-person account of that event or that lifestyle, and you hear that person tell how it happened in their memory from their personal perception, in their own words, in their own voice. And then later on, you can go back and, if that's your grandfather, like you were talking about, if you had recorded stories with your grandfather about him telling you the things that he remembers from being a kid, and maybe things that his parents and grandparents told him as well, that's something that you can go back to and visit and relive from his perspective, not from the way that you remember him telling it.
Richard, you're the Poet Laureate of Kentucky, or were. What years were those?
1999 to 2001.
You like to tell stories. You're a professor. I've heard you teach. You enjoy history. It's clear. You have a PhD in English. You like language, and you like the telling of stories. I can see this is a natural fit for you at the Oral History Commission.
History, too often, it writes, let's say, in broad strokes, and it covers significant public events. I think oral history, in many respects, not only encompasses those events, but gives us an image of the lives of more ordinary citizens as they relate to the historical context around them.
Richard, let me ask you a question, because I may have a skewed vision of this. The farther we go back in time, I want to say we lead a little simpler life. I'm wanting to say a little closer we get to the land, having to garden for our food, having to hunt and fish for our food.
Sure. And I think it's important that as our lives become increasingly complex and sort of driven by technology, it surprises me just working with young people how spotty and fragmentary their knowledge of anything beyond their own birth year is. What is lost in not finding the means to recover that somehow.
And speaking of recovering what we've lost, earlier we were talking with a man who had discovered an old cassette tape from the middle 70s. On it were some old home recordings that had really brought back some treasured memories from when he was just a little boy. Sarah, Richard, I'm telling you now, he could have found $1 million and not been any happier. In a minute, I want to get your comments on this type of old recording that many of us have. But first, Sarah, you brought a clip that illustrates that discipline of recording in oral history. Set this up for us.
In the mid-'70s, the first thing the Kentucky Oral History Commission did was they put a tape recorder in every single public library or every county public library in the state. So we put 120 tape recorders out there. And out of those 120 tape recorders, we got recordings back from 116 counties. And this recording is actually from that project. It was from the Marshall County collection. The recording was done in 1977 with a man named Gilbert Woodruff. And so you think back, he's talking about being a kid in the 1920s. He's talking about his memories of hunting. But this small clip part that I pulled out was him talking about what he did with all the pelts that he collected, what they were used for once they left his hands is just great.
So back when you were a boy, what was the main thing that you liked to hunt for in those days?
Rabbit and squirrel and possum. That's the only way that I got into Christmas money was hunting possum.
And that was to eat?
I didn't eat them much, but Daddy ate them. He liked them. But I got the hides.
Did you do your own curing of the hides?
Well, skin them. You might take boards, whittle a board off, about the shape you want your hide, stretch it over that and let it dry.
And then who bought those hides?
They had some local buyers around through the country. Some shipped them to Funston and S.C. Taylor and Sears and Roebuck went to buy them. They had several, all this lots of fur company. Biggest part of them was in St. Louis. Other than Sears and Roebuck, they bought in the Chicago store for a long time, but after they set up a place in Memphis, well, us people here had to send to Memphis for closer to what Chicago.
Did you ever do any trapping?
Not no trapping. I never was no trapper. Always just hunted. Had a pretty good doe.
What did they do with those hides?
Make furs for coats.
Out of the opossum furs?
Well, you see, they'd dye them and make anything out of them they wanted to. There's been a many little possum sold for a mink. They just dyed it and made anything out of them they wanted to.
I see.
A lot of them old timers would take a coon hide and make a cap out of it.
I like listening to that. There's been many a possum skin sold as a mink.
Sold as a mink.
That's good. That's priceless.
Good.
That's classic. But I'll bet his story was probably very similar to many kids of the era. They would do odds and end things with that there may be wild game laws against today, but they did that for the extra money they needed at the time.
Oh, yeah, it's really interesting. There's a lot of interviews that were done in that 70s, 1980s time period where you hear people talking about the progression of wildlife in their area of the state has been. You know, back when they remember there weren't any deer or turkeys, you know, and talking about what they did hunt when they were kids or where they went fishing or what they fished for and the changing ways even that they had to do that because of laws and regulations changing or different wildlife being introduced. It is really interesting.
Once upon a time, my girlfriend's daddy worked in Louisville. This had to be the late 50s. Worked filling the vending machines with lifesavers and gum, candy bars. And one of the stops along his route included a place where a very young Cassius Clay had a part-time job, sweeping up, I think the story goes. Anyway, he called Pam's daddy Candyman. And it's little tidbits like that show us some of the fascinating people that we meet along the way. A heavyweight champion of the world, athlete of the century, Muhammad Ali. None of that stuff existed then. This was the 50s. He was just a young kid boxer with a dream. And he called my would-have-been father-in-law Candyman. We still love telling that story. What I wish, however, is that I could have had a tape recorder and sat down and say, Lloyd, tell me that story. Where were you? When was this? Tell me the specifics.
Absolutely, especially with oral history. The closer you can get to an event, I'm a big proponent of getting the stories from people while they are still able to tell them and as they experience them.
Sarah, Dr. Taylor, when we come back, let's spend a few minutes talking about some of these older recordings, old tapes that we unearthed from our life, and what we might be able to do to listen to them, to preserve them. Could get interesting. My name is Charlie Baglin, and you are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We are back in our closing segment of Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin, and we're talking to a couple of folks who represent the Kentucky Oral History Commission, part of the Kentucky Historical Society. Administrator Sarah Milligan and Chair of the Commission, Dr. Richard Taylor. Welcome to you both. People record their stories, or we will find these old tapes. Perhaps we have them in our basement someplace or in a bottom drawer, and we've always wondered what they were and never really knew. Is there an enduring medium that you have found that will preserve audio so that generations with one little apparatus, whatever that is, can play it?
No. But to expand that a little bit, this is something that archives, librarians, all the people who actually deal with making sure that the media that you create today will be preserved in the future, deal with on a daily basis. When you're talking about just a small cassette tape, that maybe you recorded in the 80s, the lifespan of those, if they're being kept in a relatively steady humidity and temperature controlled space and maybe brought out once every 5 years or so and run back and forth, is about 35 years. And that's actually a pretty long lifetime for when you're talking about analog audio or video media. Reel-to-reels actually have a little bit longer lifespan than that. They're a little bit more steady. Tape in general seems to be one of the backup media that people still use, even for digital content. There isn't a physical medium that you can put those onto that's going to make sure that you can play them back, as you said, 30 years from now. The business that libraries and archives are in is making sure that those digital files and analog files converted to digital medium will be available 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And the only way to do that is to stay on top of what the technological trends are. And that's a big task, but it's something as an archive we've committed ourselves to doing. And so once we get all of those cassettes migrated to a digital medium, onto a server, onto a hard drive, we have to do it in a format that 10 years from now, when that file format is no longer usable, we can easily migrate it over to whatever is the best standard at that time.
Good friend of mine was in Vietnam back in the day, and he had a reel-to-reel recorder and would sit down and talk about his life there and what he saw and what he did and the goings-on of Vietnam life. And I think he sent these back to Kentucky to his mother. He didn't have the technology to play a reel-to-reel tape anymore. They were sitting in his attic. He threw them away.
Oh, my heart is breaking right now. In fact, that reminds me of a collection that we had donated to us maybe in the last 2 or 3 years by someone doing military oral histories who looked in her own family closet and saw that they had these recordings on reel-to-reel tape from when she and her 2 siblings were little kids and her dad was deployed to Vietnam. And he would audio record a letter and send it home. They would get together and play on the reel-to-reel recorder and send it back. And then this would go back and forth. And instead of writing letters, they recorded these little kind of what's happening in the day. So it'd be the kids sitting around maybe singing a song, or I mean, you could hear him be tired, you could hear him be homesick, you could hear him be excited, all those different things. The heart-wrenching part of that story was that he was actually killed in action the day before he was supposed to come home. And so these kids, what they grew up with from their dad were having these recordings that they could, you know, once every 10 years they would bring out and kind of replay and feel this connection to their dad. Those recordings, personal diaries and journals on tape as well, are very valuable.
That was a part of my life. I found some tapes that I'd known I'd always had, and then I realized I have the capability to put these in a digital medium. And when I listened back to them, it was a February day, and I said, my Christmas shopping is done. I know now what I'm giving my sisters for Christmas. It took 6 or 8 months to go through every one of them, every piano recital and every birthday, every Christmas. That, good or bad, is our history. And a lot of people have these tapes. Is there a message that you can give to people to encourage them to maybe dig through those boxes, see what's in there?
Oh, yeah. If you don't feel like that you have the comfort level to digitize those, there are places that definitely can do it for a fee, or sometimes there's places in your community where you can do that. They have that equipment available just for general use. For example, there's the Northside Library in Lexington has an audio studio where you can bring your tapes in and learn how to just digitize them there in the library. Really? Remember that 35-year mark, and that 35-year mark is really archival conditions for that cassette tape. So if you're seeing a cassette tape in a drawer somewhere in your bedroom or in your basement, and especially in your attic, go up and find it and give me a call, and I'll point you in the right direction. I mean, this is part of what I do on a daily basis, is help people walk through what it is that they have that's this medium and whether it can be preserved, whether you want to keep it for your own family or whether you want to talk about placing it in an archive for public accessibility.
Kentucky Historical Society, the Oral History Commission, certainly want to get it accurate. If you brought 10 people in and said, tell me a story about what happened, you will get 10 different stories. Yeah. Do you have to look for the commonalities in the story, and do those emerge as the truth, or are there 10 legitimate different stories?
Well, it is a tough question. Each of us perceives things in different ways, and if we're looking at the viewpoint of the individual, what we report is the truth for us. And so you're suggesting that there is an objective truth, and in many ways I think objective truth is a goal more than it is a reality. I've often thought that historians are approximators of the truth. there is this distortion which comes particularly when you rely on a very narrow base of sources. However, if you have multiple sources, if you could interview every survivor on the Arizona, you could get a much fuller, much more accurate picture, and you could distill what's been said in order to gain a sense of what in fact the truth is. But I'm not sure that the truth is ultimately ascertainable. It can only be approximated.
Well, I thank you all for coming by. This has been interesting. There's a question I always ask. Do you text and drive?
No.
No.
Do you know what texting is?
I do know what texting is. In fact, it's next on my list for my children to show me. You know, the truth is, I'm not much interested in texting.
Well, I hope that truth is objective and not just approximated. From the Kentucky Oral History Commission, Sarah Milligan, and Commission Chair Dr. Richard Taylor. Let me give a web address if you would like to probe further on the oral, spoken histories of Kentucky. passtheword.ky.gov. Again, passtheword.ky.gov. I'm Charlie Baglin. Join us again in a week. We will go inside outdoors again here on Kentucky Afield Radio.